so welcome back to our chapter dedicated to anatomy. And this is the section that's going to talk about forward bending. Forward bending is a very common action here for us as human beings. We're oftentimes, maybe at work, maybe at home, maybe with our kids, we're going to the ground and we're coming back up. So I want to discuss really what's going on with the forward bend. This is just the first part of a conversation about forward bending. We're going to get even more into it as well with a bit more anatomy, but this is something that I want to just begin to introduce the theme. What happens when we forward bend in a healthy way as opposed to what happens when we forward bend in a way that is structurally unsound? Okay, so I'm going to take out our pelvis here. We're going to look at the pelvis, and then we're going to see what we're talking about actually, and then we're going to kind of look and see how that relates to the picture, and then I'm going to demonstrate it and see if it all makes any sense. Okay, so we're going to be talking here about forward bending. Now, notice that we've discussed the hamstrings, okay, and so we're going to kind of bring the hamstrings back into the picture, and the hamstrings are coming down, from the back of the leg, and they're attaching down here, okay, and we have our pelvis. And so if you've ever, most people don't study this stuff, I grant you that, but if you ever had studied this stuff, you would have heard the idea that a forward bending requires pelvic rotation. Okay, that's kind of just like a little fact of anatomy. Pelvic rotation is required in forward bending. Okay, well, in order for the pelvis to rotate, as we're going to see very soon, the hamstrings have to allow that to happen. Okay, well, as long as the pelvis rotates, for example, in the case of this picture here off to the side, the pelvis rotating all the way down creates a forward bend that is a healthy forward bend without any stress or strain in the lower back. The reason why there's no stress or strain in the lower back is because the pelvis is rotating. Of course, the reason why the pelvis is rotating has to do with the hamstrings, which is what we're going to be discussing in a different chapter, but let's just first recognize what we're talking about, which is when the pelvis rotates, we can have a healthy forward bend. And this goes for a sitting forward bend or a standing forward bend. But listen, let me allow this opportunity to be the first time I say this. All of these forward bends are not okay for us with lower back pain and lower back history. Anytime we're going to do any kind of pose with a straight leg or any kind of action with straight leg forward bends, we want to be really careful, and we're definitely not going to be using this particular action to be doing anything therapeutic, and that's going to be something I talk about when I talk about commonly made mistakes for us people with lower back pain. I will revisit that, but I don't mind kind of discussing some things more than once, okay, really emphasizing things that I consider to be really important here in this course. Okay, so when a pelvis is rotating, then we have a healthy forward bend. Well, what happens if the pelvis doesn't rotate? What happens if the pelvis doesn't rotate? Well, if the pelvis doesn't rotate, we're going to be having a situation that looks exactly like this. Okay? Pelvis doesn't rotate, person is forward bending anyway, and as a result of the forward bending, without pelvic rotation, the stress or strain is going to reflect only here into the lower back. Okay? So really appreciating that when it comes to a forward bend, we must have pelvic rotation. Now, as a result, that's why there's always a solution when we're doing forward bending. And the solution is going to be called bend your knees. Okay, so now I'm going to show you this. I'm going to demonstrate, first these two scenarios, and then why bending your knees is going to be very helpful. Okay, and of course in the later lessons we're going to be discussing how to stand up, how to sit up, how to lift things off the ground and really get into, the actual means to do this stuff safely, applying all of this, structural information. But for now we're just going to kind of look at it, see it, and then deal and discuss how to do it in these later chapters. Okay, so I'm going to stand up now. The hamstrings are coming from the back and attaching onto my sitting bones, which are right here at the bottom of my pelvis. And as I go into a forward bend, my sitting bones are rising up. Okay, they're actually rising up as I go forward. And the reason why they're rising up is my pelvis is rotating, and as my pelvis rotates, like we showed you with the bone, the sitting bones are now inverting and they're coming up. Well, the only way that I can allow this to happen, or that it is happening, is that my hamstrings are getting longer. So here I am, my hamstrings are at one length, and then as I rotate forward, my hamstrings are growing, growing, growing. My pelvis is rotating as a result of that, and so in that case, it's actually okay. As long as I'm doing that, as long as I get my pelvic rotation, it's fine. Now, I don't mean to say that if you have severe back pain, you would ever want to do any kind of forward bending at all. With severe back pain, it's not a good idea to do any kind of forward bending like this. We're going to be learning how to really work with that stuff. But I'm just showing you the anatomy of a forward bend and why pelvic rotation gets limited, and then when it gets limited, what happens. Okay? So here we are. In my case, because my hamstrings are not as tight as they could be, I'm rotating, I'm getting my pelvic rotation, and it's starting to look closer to this, and that's okay. Well, if my hamstrings were tight, and they were locked in onto my sitting bones, and they were tight, and then I try to forward bend anyway, but my pelvis won't rotate, and it won't rotate because my hamstrings are tight, but now I'm going to go to forward bend anyway, and now I'm going to look like this, or any derivative of this. It doesn't really matter if you touch your toes or not. If you're hanging off your lower back like that, that's not going to be a good thing. Okay? Now, what happens when you bend your knees to do something? Like, okay, I want to lift something off the ground, so I'm going to bend my knees. Well, the bending of the knees really, in context like that, becomes a major solution. Why? Because when you bend your knees, your pelvis rotates. So, legs straight, pelvis won't rotate. Bend the knees, now the hamstrings are no longer taut, they're no longer pulling, and now the pelvis can rotate. And so now, if I needed to do an action related to the ground, and I did it with my knees bent, that's going to be a safer way to approach whatever the action is. Now, depending on the situation, depending on what you're lifting and all that, there might be even safer ways, but that's the point of this little introduction, is to show you that when our hamstrings are going to be tight, the pelvis is not going to rotate, and that's going to cause this. And this comes, and it can be one of two situations. This can be herniated discs, or this can be something that we'll be discussing as well, called the sacroiliac ligament overextension. Okay, so kind of this little discussion was just to show you what pelvic rotation is supposed to be looking like in forward bends. In one of these upcoming lessons, we're going to be really analyzing exactly why this happens, kind of a review and kind of a putting it all together lesson so that we can make sure that you own this information and you really appreciate what's going on in every way from an anatomical perspective for your lower back pain. Okay, so we'll see you in the next lesson, and I hope you're catching this. Hope you're realizing that this is really going to make all the difference. These little details are not so little, so here we go. Get ready. Pain-free life on the way.